Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 239, Lady Doverdale. Audrey Ailsa Pointing was born on the 20th of April 1910 in Sydney to Arthur Pointing and Elsie, Vida, Agnes Davis. Arthur Pointing owned several butchers' shops in Sydney, which had a reputation for high quality and modern cleanliness, but Arthur also had other interests. He didn't work in the shops himself. Customers were greeted with attractive displays of choice cuts of meat amongst palm fronds served by smartly dressed butchers. It was a very different experience to many butchers' shops of the era. Arthur had harness racing as another interest and an unspecified but obviously very lucrative investment source. Arthur's father, Albert, had been a City of Paddington alderman for many years and was Mayor of Sydney in 1900, 1911 and 1912. Arthur and Elsie lived in Wallara for most of the 1910s and early 1920s in a large beachfront home they built themselves. Audrey was a star pupil of the well-known Sydney dance teacher Minnie Hooper. In late 1923 and early 1924, 14-year-old Audrey appeared on stage at the Grand Opera House in Castlereagh, Sydney for Hugh Ward's revusical panto The Rockets. In the Sydney Truth on the 6th of January 1924, it reported Audrey Pointing, 13 years old, in Rockets, daughter of Arthur Pointing and granddaughter of Albert Pointing, ex-mayor of Paddington. In March 1924, she featured in Tons of Money. Probably enthused with what they'd seen of the world on their trip several years before, the Pointing family packed up and departed for England, arriving there in June 1924. Their departure was announced in the Sydney Sunday Times on the 27th of April 1924. Miss Audrey Pointing, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Pointing of Loftus, Darling Point, who leaves with her parents by the RMS Ormond on Wednesday next with the object of obtaining further experience in her profession as a dancer in Europe. A star pupil of Miss Minnie Hooper, she also studied under Professor Rowe of Philadelphia and Madame Viola in New York. A strikingly pretty, clever dancer, she's just finished a 12-month engagement in which she appeared in The Rockets and Tons of Money. Audrey has just turned 14. And in the Sydney Sun on the 21st of September 1924, Audrey Pointing, an Australian girl, is a solo dancer at the London Palladium. Her chance came through understudying for Mademoiselle Natova, a well-known favourite, who was suddenly obliged through illness to leave the bill. And on the 12th of October 1924 in the Sydney Sunday Times, Miss Audrey Pointing, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. A. Pointing of Darling Point, went to London some time ago to study dancing and is now understudying Mademoiselle Natova at the Palladium. Miss Pointing was recently appearing in 3 solo dances each night and scored a brilliant success. Arthur returned to Australia every few years to attend to his affairs. The Beach Road home was finally sold in October 1925, including all its contents. The family had relocated to an apartment near Hyde Park in London's West End. Audrey Pointing was found in the chorus lineup for several shows from the late 1920s, such as the musical Peggy Ann that ran at Daly's Theatre for 4 months in 1927. In 1931 in London, she was described as an Australian chorus girl. On the 2nd of May 1931 in the Melbourne Australiasian, it announced that news had been received of the marriage in New York on the 9th of March of Mr. Robert Charles Maxwell Jr. and Miss Audrey Ailsa Pointing, daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Pointing of Sydney. By the early 1930s, Audrey had made a name for herself on the British stage, especially for her well-received work in some new Noel Coward productions. These included the London and New York versions of the revue This Year of Grace, the operetta Bittersweet, and the comedy Private Lives. I couldn't find any evidence of separation and divorce from Robert Maxwell. However, her second marriage occurred to Edward Alexander Partington, who was the 3rd Baron of Doverdale, a paper manufacturer, on the 18th of May 1933 at St James's Church in Sussex Gardens, London, and she retired from the stage. In the Lismore Northern Star on the 16th of April 1935, Lady Doverdale, Sydney actress, London. Miss Audrey Poynting, the Sydney-born actress, has become the new Lady Doverdale. Her husband, Mr. Oswald Partington, succeeded to the peerage this week on the death of his father. Miss Poynting, who is 25, married Mr. Partington in London 5 years ago. One of her leading engagements here was to be an understudy to Miss Gertrude Lawrence in the London production of Noel Coward's Private Lives in 1930. And on the 14th of October 1937 in the Sydney Sun, Australian girl's magnificent English home, Lord and Lady Doverdale. When Mrs. Herbert Field of Bellevue Hill returned recently from London, she brought with her these pictures of Westwood Park, Rochester, the country home of her niece and nephew-in-law, Lord and Lady Doverdale. Lady Doverdale was formerly Miss Audrey Poynting of Sydney, and her grandmother is Mrs. A. Poynting of Darling Point. One picture shows the home, the other the lodge gates leading into Westwood Park, and on the right are Lord and Lady Doverdale in their coronation robes. Their London home is Arlington House. And on the 12th of November 1938, formerly Audrey Poynting of Sydney, she married the popular and immensely wealthy Teddy Doverdale. Since her marriage, she's become intensely interested in politics and is now numbered amongst the leading political hostesses. Lord Doverdale is an active member of the House of Lords, rarely missing from his seat in the upper house, while there are a few important debates which Lady Doverdale does not attend. At the beginning of the crisis, Lord and Lady Doverdale were holidaying in Monte Carlo. When Parliament was hastily reassembled, they made a non-stop drive to London and were present in the galleries of the House of Commons when Mr. Chamberlain made his dramatic move for peace. Both at Westwood Park, their country home, and Arlington House, their modern Mayfair flat, Lady Doverdale's parties are noted for the brilliant guests they attract, and the sparkling wit of the younger politicos is a feature of her dinner table. In 1938, there was a photo of her in a paper, and it said a new photograph of Lady Doverdale, formerly Miss Audrey Poynting of Sydney, who is chairman of the committee organising the enormous luncheon party and fashion contrast display which will be given at the Dorchester Hotel in London for charity. The Duchess of Gloucester has promised to attend. And in 1940, Lord Doverdale, wealthy English nobleman whose wife was Sydney's Audrey Poynting, is a special constable. Lady Doverdale, the former Audrey Poynting of Sydney, considers her husband Teddy's job as a war reserve policeman in the same light. I'm not quite certain what he has to do except dash around on a motorbike if there is an air raid, but he has a full uniform, a truncheon and a whistle, and I rather like having a policeman round the house. Lady Doverdale told me an amusing incident about her husband's air warden's job. Seeing a light in a friend's house, he knocked at the door and pointed out that the air raid regulations were being broken. The butler, who knew Lord Doverdale well, went to the mistress of the house and said, "Lord Doverdale, the policeman, ma'am, is complaining about our lights. Shall I show him in?" Lady Doverdale is just as busy on war work as her husband. She is a fully fledged Red Cross nurse. And on the 8th of April 1943 in the Sydney Daily Mirror, there was an incorrect report of Lord Doverdale's death. In London, Lady Doverdale, formerly Audrey Poynting of Sydney, said yesterday that she was bewildered when she received a cable from her father recently asking if her husband had died. The death of Lord Doverdale, who succeeded to the title in 1935, was incorrectly reported in March. "My husband has been very ill for months," said Lady Doverdale, "and he had a serious operation a year ago, but he's certainly not in any danger at the moment. I cannot understand how the story got around." Lord Doverdale, the Honorary Edward Alexander Partington, 3rd Baron of Doverdale, did die on the 18th of January 1949 at Westwood Park at Worcestershire, England, aged only 44. And on the 26th of July 1949 in the Melbourne Herald, it was reported from London, Lady Doverdale, formerly Miss Audrey Poynting, a Sydney-born actress, may return to Australia because the trustees of her late husband's estate have decided to sell the family seat, Westwood Park at Droitwich Spa, Worcestershire. She's occupied Westwood Park since her marriage to Lord Doverdale in 1933. It comprises of an Elizabethan mansion, 4,200 acres, 18 farms and 67 cottages. It includes the village of Hampton, Lovett, and part of the villages of Doversdale and Elmbridge. Lord Doverdale, who died in January, left an estate worth £455,000, on which £250,000 probate duty was paid. There is no heir to the title. Lady Doverdale said today, "Nobody was more surprised than I at the trustees' decision to sell up Westwood Park. It was the family's hope that the house would be preserved for the nation. My husband was a life tenant, and on his death, the estate reverted to a trust created by his father." Audrey then married Major Ernest Ivamy Rowett on the 21st of January 1950 at Nassau, Bahamas, when she was 40. On the 2nd of November 1952 in the Sydney Truth, it reported that in London, returning to Sydney on the Orcades after many years' absence is the former Audrey Poynting, who married Lord Doverdale when understudying Gertie Lawrence 19 years ago. After her husband's death 3 years ago, Audrey married Major Rowett, but she is still known as Lady Doverdale. Just after her marriage, a notice appeared in the Times announcing that she would continue to use the name Doverdale, so on the ship's passenger list, Audrey appears under the D's as Lady Doverdale and her husband among the R's. And on the 30th of November 1952 in the Sydney Sun, Lady Doverdale here on holiday. Former Sydney actress Audrey Poynting, now Lady Doverdale, arrives here this week by the Orcades for a 3-week look-around. "First thing I want to do is take a trip to the Blue Mountains," she said. "The mountains hold such wonderful memories for me. They recall the excitement of childhood holidays and many happy weekends." This is Lady Doverdale's first home visit in 30 years. She charmed London in the early 30s by her sophisticated performances with Noel Coward and Gertrude Lawrence in Private Lives. She left the stage in 1933 to marry Lord Doverdale, managing director of Barrow Paper Mills and owner of one of England's biggest estates. Although Lady Doverdale is now married to Major Rowett, formerly of the Secret Service, she retains her title. She and the Major divide their time between their homes at Nassau in the Bahamas and Milan in Italy. But life in the Bahamas, my dear, is just too boring. Lady Doverdale will return to England on the Orcades in 3 weeks' time, fly to Nassau for a fortnight, back to England for 8 days, and then to Italy, where she hopes to spend some time. Lady Doverdale and Major Rowett were met by Lady Doverdale's cousin, Mrs. T.A. Field of Bellevue Hill, and her daughter Diana. And a report on the 26th of May 1956 in the Melbourne Argus says that taxation has forced some Australians to live abroad. Lady Doverdale in the Bahamas, who 7 years ago was left £500,000 by her husband, the 3rd Baron. She met Lord Doverdale on a blind date. Some time ago, I interviewed Lady Doverdale in her super luxury flat behind the Ritz Hotel just before she took off to the Bahamas. She wore overalls with diamond clips on the pockets, 5 ropes of pearls, diamond earrings, diamond rings and diamond bracelets that reached nearly up to her armpits. She only lacked a tiara, but she was, of course, packing that. She talked about going broke the whole time. Audrey died on the 17th of July 1970 in France, aged 60. Audrey's siblings: a sister, Glenore Joan Poynting, who used the name Glen Alyn, was born in Sydney on the 30th of September 1913. Glenore attended Asham School in 1918 and 1919, where she was known as Glenny, and Audrey was also a student at that school. The girls were boarders for a time in 1919 while their parents took a trip to the US. It seems the parents enjoyed the tour so much they decided to take the girls to the US, and they departed on the SS Ventura in January 1921. While on this trip, at aged only 7, she determined to go on stage. In later years, the story was that the Australian comedian Clyde Cook, then working in Hollywood, had shown the 2 girls around a studio. Glen's first recorded performance was in 1931 at the age of 18. Film biographies of the 1930s claim that she spent 6 years training as a dancer and, like Audrey, she first appeared on stage in the chorus for musicals in the early 1930s. Her first credited role in film was a supporting one in the 1931 British medical drama The Outsider. It was followed by another supporting role in Michael Powell's Born Lucky, a 1932 B film. She also took the love interest role in Clyde Cook's 1934 Trouble in Store. For newspaper reviewers, Glen's roles were not big enough to be noted in passing, but not significant enough to be seriously critiqued. All that was written about her role in Trouble in Store was that she spoke well. On the stage, Glen was listed as a dancer in He Wanted Adventure, a musical which ran at the Savile Theatre for 5 months in 1933. In late 1933, she adopted the stage name Glen Alyn. At about the same time, she took a credited role in the Stanley Lupino musical That's a Pretty Thing that ran at Daly's Theatre for 4 months. Following several good reviews for her part in the 1936 film Grand Finale, Glen signed a contract with Warner Brothers UK. While under contract to Warner's over the period of 1937 to 1938, she appeared in at least 13 films, many mixed and many of them requiring to perform what she later described as other women roles. When she appeared opposite Hugh Williams in The Perfect Crime in 1938, another journalist would only categorise her as glamorous. There are some surviving films that Glen features in. One is Ealing's The War Case in 1938, where she took a supporting role in several short scenes. Law and Disorder in 1940, which was a spy drama, where Glen appeared in several scenes as an overdressed foreign German spy pretending to be a reporter. She had a bar scene in the film Lady in Distress in 1939, and there's a publicity photo of a very blonde Glen with Michael Redgrave. On the 13th of August 1939, Glen is featured in the San Francisco Examiner with US tennis player Don Budge. The article noted she was an ambulance driver and her steel helmet hangs behind her. In November 1940, the London Evening Standard reported that Glen Alyn had been chased by a shark. Glen left a clue to the reason for this story when speaking to the same newspaper years later. By 1954, she could honestly report that her career had been a persistent plodding on. She'd never really had an outstanding success. On the 4th of March 1941 in the Sydney Morning Herald. Versatile role of Sydney girl in London, films, ambulance work and firefighting. Glen Alyn, youngest sister of Australian-born Lady Doverdale, has been driving an ambulance and making films since the beginning of the war. At Christmas, she made her bow in cabaret and appeared billed as the simple sophisticate at the Café de Paris, which has survived the war and is still one of the smartest restaurants in London. Café de Paris was a Coventry Street nightclub. This week, she added another role to her activities by volunteering as a fire watcher. She lives in a luxury block of flats overlooking Hyde Park. When the Blitz began, more and more tenants moved to the country, with the result that only 14 tenants were left to take on the responsibility of the whole block. There was nothing else for it, we just had to volunteer. She'll go on 8-hour shifts once every 8 days. She knows how to use a stirrup pump and has worked out a system of alarm bells, which the owners of the flats have taken up and elaborated. Miss Alyn confesses that she has often been nervous during the Blitz and that she has not ceased being thankful that she happened to be staying at Lady Doverdale's flat on the night a high-explosive bomb fell next door. But even though she could leave London, she thinks it's her duty to stay and do what part-time work she can. Although I must confess I was a little shaken when I came home to find the water in the baths, kept filled for fire emergencies, had spilled over on the floor as the house swayed. Glen Alyn, who's the youngest daughter of Mr. Arthur Pointing of Darling Point, Sydney, has lived in England since 1934. As children in Sydney, she and her sister both went to Minnie Hooper's ballet classes. In London, she was a pupil of Anna Pavlova's partner and would have gone into Pavlova's company had it not been for the dancer's death. She made her first appearance in London as a chorus girl in Charlotte's Revue, then went to America as one of Cochrane's young ladies, returned to London and was appearing with a Charlotte Revue at the Savoy when Eric Hackham, the film producer, saw her and asked her to make a test. She made The Outsider and loathed it. When her first film was finished, she went back to the stage, appearing in one of John Van Druten's plays in the West End. The same thing happened. Irving Asher saw her act and thought she had film possibilities. She had another test and signed up for Warner Brothers. She made another film but did not enjoy her work and went back to dailies. Then Captain Richard Norton signed her up for British and Dominions, for which she made several films before Warner Brothers bought up her contract. Today, Glen Alyn has made about 50 films. Her latest ones were Husband-in-Law with Barry Barnes and Window in London with Michael Redgrave, and she loves making them. She's usually allowed to design her own clothes for films, but for her engagement at Café de Paris, she wore a full-skirted emerald green velvet dress, which Ravis is sending over in the New York collection. Off the stage, she wears a great deal of black. Glen Alyn's flat, chosen because it was near her ambulance headquarters, is furnished in tones of rose and pale silvery green. Lady Doverdale, her sister, is running the RAF Comforts Fund from Berkeley Square headquarters. Glen Alyn knits for her when she is not singing in a Mayfair cabaret, making a film, which means leaving for the film studio at about 5:30 a.m, driving her ambulance or fire watching. In 1943, Glen toured provincial England in the popular musical Chu Chin Chow. Sometime in the mid-1940s, Glen met Stanley Grove Spiro, a London financier who was 14 years older than Glen. Spiro had previously been married to Stephanie and they had a daughter in April 1924 who died at 5 days old. They also had a son in 1928. Spiro had fled England in early 1937 after arrest warrants alleging significant financial fraud were issued. Within the previous week or 10 days, he obtained in cash £12,000. On the 7th of May 1937, in the Launceston Examiner of Tasmania, web of deceit, alleged trickster, evidence in court. The action in which a widow and her 3 sons alleged that they lost nearly £12,000 through parting with valuable securities to Stanley Groves Spiro, stated to be in Mexico, whom the council described as a ringleader of a gang operating bucket shops. This was continued in the King's Bench Division of London recently. Heather Beatrice Brendan of Ivybridge, Devon, Robert Edwards Henty Brendan, John Woodville Brendan, Arthur Geoffrey Cunningham Brendan and Thomas Robert McCready claimed damages for alleged fraudulent conspiracy from Stanley Groves Spiro, McLean and Henderson, S.R. Bunt and Co., Samuel Taylor and William Underhill. McCready's claim was as executor with R.E. Brendan and J.W. Brendan of the estate of the late Charles Ernest Brendan. The defence was a denial of the alleged conspiracy. Mrs. Brendan gave evidence, and she said on the 13th of July 1935, a man who called himself James McLean, but who resembled a photograph of Spiro, called at their home. He called again on the 21st of July and had a long talk to Mr. Brendan about investments. Mrs. Brendan said she gave McLean a cheque and he promised to invest the money in the Scottish Gas Utilities Corporation, but added that he would have to wait until he could buy at an advantageous price. On the next day, share certificates were sent to McLean and Henderson. When Sergeant Percy Johnston was called to produce the books of McLean and Henderson, he said they were required also in investigations at the instance of the Director of Public Prosecutions. Mr. Wynne, addressing the jury on behalf of Samuel Taylor and S.H. Hunt and Co., said, "Has not Mexican been described as a deceiver of men, a man who has woven a spider's web of deceit in which to entrap the Brendans? He was a clever trickster who deceived Mr. C. E. Brendan, an experienced and shrewd businessman." Spiro disappeared but then surrendered himself in early 1938. On the 9th of December 1938 in the Albury Banner and Wodonga Express, share-pushing swindler, love of son led him to justice. Remarkable story of fraudulent exploits. Head of a band of commercial brigands who made war upon the community, to use the words of the recorder at the Old Bailey, London, Stanley Groves Spiro, a 45-year-old financial wizard and city shark, has started a sentence of 8 years penal servitude. Victims of his golden tongue, shrewd, hard-headed investors poured thousands of pounds into his fraudulent companies, swelling his bank accounts so that he ran a country home, luxury cars and a private aeroplane. This inevitably came to a showdown. With a warrant out for his arrest and detectives hot on his trail, Spiro fled from London and for 18 months, by a series of daring ruses, successfully eluded the police of the world. It was in February 1937 that Spiro fled from England. Disguised by a wig and dark glasses, he went to Vienna. Scotland Yard had flashed his description to all foreign police forces, and detectives were watching at the stations when he arrived. But luck was with Spiro. On the same train was the Duke of Windsor, and unnoticed among the throng who had come to welcome the distinguished visitor, Spiro made a quick exit. From country to country Spiro travelled, dogged by the fear of arrest, never staying long anywhere. He even went as far afield as South America, and then came back again to Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Meanwhile, his wife, daughter of a country clergyman, was dying from an incurable disease. When she died, their son was left in the care of a former employee. For the boy, Spiro risked his liberty. Worry over the future of his 10-year-old son, to whom he is devoted, brought him back to England and to justice. On a dark winter's night, an oil tanker from the continent chugged her way up the Thames. In that ship was Spiro. Dodging the dock police, he made his way to the house of a friend in Lowther Road, Barnes. He'd been there only a few hours when the police swooped. It was not until he was granted bail that he was able to see his boy. When he took his place in the dock, Spiro, square-shouldered, bald and bespectacled, pled guilty to 9 cases of conspiracy, false pretences and fraudulent conversion in connection with the sale of shares through a company called McLean and Henderson. "I put forward," said counsel, "as the head of the whole of this share-pushing swindle, which went on practically the whole of 1935 and 1936. The methods adopted by Spiro and his associates were that they got hold of well-established businesses in Scotland, which had carried on perfectly reputable business of outside stockbrokers. This was followed by taking an office, and then they had the old clients to whom they would write. In addition, they started the publication, the Weekly Financial Review, or some such paper, circulating and rising the people who had no former connections in that way and enlarged their clientele. In February 1936, a concern called Bunt and Company was started, and it went into Spiro's own pocket. Mr. McClure said the amount involved in the indictment was about £65,000. The whole of the account to which there had been pleas of not guilty altered that amount by certainly not more than £10,000. The whole thing was one gigantic swindle. Mr. McClure mentioned a charge relating to the purchase of shares by a man in East Anglis, whose name he asked should not be made public. This man, he said, was visited by Spiro in the name of Royston. So persuasive was he that within an hour the man had promised to forward to Spiro Securities the value of over £17,000. A document was afterwards found in the offices relating to this man, and it read, "Wealthy man, nice to speak to, puts whiskey bottle on table, likes to talk a lot, been in India, been a rubber planter, feel sure you will get him." And get him Spiro did. In 1936, Spiro gave the name of McLean and called on a man in Devonshire who was alleged to be a victim. The man died and his relatives never received a penny. Spiro pled not guilty to this count. "I cannot give any real idea of the magnitude of this fraud," added Mr. McClure. "Banking accounts show a turnover of just under £600,000. I'm not suggesting anything like that sum was the proceeds of fraud, but I do suggest that a very large proportion of the proceeds of cheques and securities handed to McLean and Henderson went into Spiro's own pocket." In his plea for leniency at the Old Bailey, Mr. Hermerde, defending, told the judge that Spiro was anxious to make good and to retrieve the position in which he found himself so that his son should not be ashamed of him. In the cells below the court, before he was taken to prison, Spiro told his friends, "Thank God my wife is dead, she could not have borne it." Stanley Groves Spiro, 45-year-old financier, was sentenced to 8 years penal servitude in Old Bailey for share-pushing frauds. He might have been one of the leading figures of the English commercial theatre had his greed for money not led him to prey on society. A friend said Stanley Spiro just knew what the people who gave him their money didn't know, that in the world you can't get something for nothing, honestly. Eric Maschwitz, author of the big musical success Balalaika, reveals the other side of Spiro. Spiro, through nominees, backed this show. We might have made £10,000 out of it, but before it became a success, he fled the country and was made bankrupt in his absence. He did not receive a penny for one of the honest efforts of his life. When I was writing Balalaika, Spiro took a tremendous interest. When I went to Budapest to get more colour for it, he came over in his luxurious private aeroplane and flew me about. He was mad about the theatre and inspired everyone with whom he came in contact. I knew nothing about his private life apart from the theatre. On the last night of the show, he came to the Adelphi Theatre to see it. He had just left prison on bail. The company all gathered around him, cheered him, and sang for "He's a jolly good fellow." He inspired confidence in his clients by a display of wealth. His beautiful wife died recently, and their 9-year-old son is living under an assumed name in a house in London with the former chauffeur to the Spiro family. It was his mother's dying wish that the chauffeur should take care of him. He promised he would, and great precautions were taken to prevent the lad's identity from becoming known to his schoolmates. So as mentioned, even though he got an 8-year term, he was released early, reportedly in exchange for providing helpful information to the authorities. On the 3rd of March 1945, in the Dowering Guardian and Amory Line Advocate in Western Australia, commercial brigand gave RAF hot tip. "This is the end, Spiro. You must go to prison for 8 years. As the head of a band of commercial brigands, you have preyed on the community long enough." So spoke the English judge back in 1938 when justice eventually caught up with the colourful confidence trickster Stanley Groves Spiro. Given a record of good behaviour, Stanley would now have been eligible for release, but recent inquiries show that he's been free for more than 2 years. The reason now officially announced by prison authorities, Spiro gave the RAF a hot tip on the Nazis, and liberty was his reward. The hot tip was conveyed to high-ranking RAF officers who visited Spiro in his cell and resulted in the successful bombing of the island of Sylt in the North Sea just off the German coast. The information had been gleaned by Spiro from his late wife, who owned property on Sylt, and who had told him that before the war, on one of her periodical visits, she'd stumbled on elaborate airfields and waterways the Germans were constructing there.
Fantastic touch to the Cell interview with the RAF was the fact that during World War I, Spiro was an officer in the Air Force. He was wounded twice, shot down over Germany and repatriated. Back in civilian life, he turned to the brokerage business where his main activity was persuading clients to exchange good stocks for bad. When the law got on his trail, Spiro escaped to France by paying fishermen lavishly to row him across the channel. Eventually he returned to England and gave himself up. The day Spiro was released from Brixton in England was the final night of the great theatrical success, Balalaika, which he had backed heavily. He went to the theatre and celebrated the occasion by giving a party on the stage to the whole staff. So it's quite possible that with Spiro's backing of the musical Balalaika in 1936 that this is where he may have met Glen. In 1944, Stanley dropped the surname Spiro. There was an article in the paper in October 1944. Notice is hereby given that I, Stanley Joseph Grove Spiro of Bank Chambers, London, a natural-born British subject, intends, after the expiration of 21 days, to assume the name of Stanley Joseph Grove in lieu and in substitution for my present name of Stanley Joseph Grove Spiro. Glen and Stanley married quietly in England in early 1947. Glen returned to acting full-time after the war. She must have achieved some satisfaction from her role in the musical Under the Counter. The show enjoyed a long run on the West End, but it closed after 3 weeks at New York's Shubert Theatre in October 1947. Its theme of wartime black marketeering did not resonate in the US. Stanley died of heart failure barely a year and a half later in October 1948. On the 11th of January 1949 in the Melbourne Argus, it announces his death. Swindler dies in London. Stanley Spiro, financier, who was imprisoned for having organised a gigantic share-pushing swindle, has died at the age of 52. Secrecy surrounded his death, just as it did his second marriage 2 years ago to the Australian actress Glen Alyn, who's the sister of Lady Doverdale. He married her in February 1947 in London in the name he assumed after he left jail, Stanley Joseph Grove. Spiro served only 4 years of his sentence of 8 years. At his trial, it was revealed he swindled investors of more than £100,000. Glen continued to appear on the British stage for the next 20 years, and comments she made suggest the stage had become her preference. Her work was a mix of comedy and drama in new and established work and was often well received. In reviewing the 1950 play, The Non-Resident, Hubert Griffith singled Glen out as an actress of considerable talent and force, but he qualified this with the comment that Glen's was a name new to me. As she observed herself to the Evening Standard in 1954, this was her challenge. Glen had not had major success to establish her name. Among Glen's last screen appearances was the leading role in the BBC's 1954 historical drama, The Gentle Falcon. This was a 7-part children's television serial based on Hilda Lewis's historical novel. Glen returned to Sydney permanently in January 1972. She'd lived in England for almost 50 years. She made no effort to resume her career in Australia. She lived her remaining life in a modest apartment in Double Bay and then in Bondi, and she died in Bondi in October 1984 at the age of 71, with Australians being completely oblivious to her presence. Or perhaps this is what she wanted.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.